Introducing Owen Youngman, our lunch speaker. Professor Youngman is Knight Professor of Digital Media Strategy at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. That follows 37 years on first editorial staff and then new product development and innovation and interactive media at the Chicago Tribune, where Professor Youngman was the Tribune's first director of interactive media. And in his bio, you see him bringing technology to bear in the practice of journalism, really at a time of wrenching change, both in the tech field and in journalism. So you must have ridden a lot of waves, not all of which were a lot of fun to ride.
I got very wet very often, yeah.
At Medill, he taught one of the school's first 6 MOOCs through Coursera, and he blogs at owenyoungman.com. Please welcome him. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here back at Westmont, where I have friends. For those of you who are on staff at Westmont, I'm staying with the Pointers, who I know from when they used to attend my church in Illinois when he was at Trinity. So glad to be here and see them, and I've run into some of you before. And then I got here and was, 2 things surprised me. One is that it wasn't 5 degrees when I got off the plane at LAX, and that the other was that the second people I saw when I got to the conference were 4 people from North Park University, where I went to school. And so it's a delight to be here. And so I have to be on really good behavior because they'll bring back reports that if I'm not careful, the president will uninvite me from the board where I'm supposed to go back on in the fall. So that said, what I was asked to do today is a partial. I didn't know how well this would fit with things that we've been hearing about and talking about. Particularly, we've heard a lot about whether it's possible or reasonable to assess whether learning is happening in these massive open online course environments. And I've got some numbers from some first level survey work that I did, from which I've drawn some inferences and which I hope will engender some additional conversation. And I really found that the 2 constructs that we ended yesterday with and began today with are helpful for me then to start thinking about the data I'm going to show you and start to ask myself whether any of the inferences that I've drawn over time before I got here can be demonstrated or thought to intersect with these. And that might be a valuable way to have a conversation later. But I found these were not the starting points when I taught the first MOOC at Northwestern. The university has launched 6 of these by now. Mine was the first, started in the fall, and I'll talk a little bit about. I wasn't intending to spend a lot of context time, but I'll just give you. These were the goals for we did have goals for entering this, and so here on the left are what the provost goals for Northwesterns entering this space were in an interview in February. And when I blogged about it a month later after I'd been asked to do one, there is some intersection here, and there are some things that maybe are a little bit different. But I didn't go into it trying to replace undergraduate education, right? to be clear, or to replace graduate education, but really more to try to learn what this was like. And my experience starting the internet business at the Chicago Tribune, and my experience being online since the early 1980s, if it taught me anything, is that firsthand experience is the only way to draw reasonable conclusions about huge trends that are affecting culture, are affecting the business I'm in. And so naturally I wanted to see what it would be like to try this, just as I was interested to see what it would be like when I launched ChicagoTribune.com on the internet. How many of these things did I achieve? And this is I think we learned a number, but if you look at my check boxes here, on the left-hand side, the one that, and this is an old slide, so this is not affected by what I heard yesterday, just my inclusion of it is. The gap, where I think that the gap exists based on my first experience, is still in the evaluation part, although I'm trying to get to some of that in what I'll subsequently show you. And we didn't do a very good job engaging with our alumni in my course, although others that have been taught since then are doing a better job. I think that there's the idea of engaging with alumni in a productive way could easily be a primary goal of a large online teaching environment. So anyway, we talked about, this title of this talk is Selected Lessons from My Worldwide Classroom. So in my case, here's what my worldwide classroom looks like in a couple of different ways. It's Google Earth, right? Every one of those pins is the IP address of a student who passed my course. And so I thought it would be easier just to put up a screen grab and not worry about the internet. But from everywhere from Riyadh to Hyderabad to Reunion Island on the other side of the world, we knew exactly, this is part of the data when Coursera talks about there being a lot of data. Here's some data. And it's an interesting distribution, and it shows, at the very least, it shows interest in access to whatever version of American higher education is provided by a course like this. So that's one way to think about my worldwide classroom. But here's another. This is where one of the students took the course, quote unquote. This is the break room at a business in Germany where a student named Alexander took the course. By coincidence, Alexander was the only one of the thousands of students who took the course who actually scored 100 out of 100. So that was, I was pleased. It proved that I hadn't set an impossible task. But there really are classrooms, and as we'll see in a minute, there really are people. And that's a useful construct too. And so I've been thinking a lot about the fact that Alexander got 100 out of 100 is part of figuring out if this worked. This is the piece I wrote that ran on the back page of the Chronicle in December, where I proposed that a good way to start thinking about whether students were educated and whether there was value was by actually asking them. And so I did a fair amount of that. Because, these people are not just pins on a map, right? These are real students with real names and real interests. This is just the first half of the A's. This is not from Coursera. This is from a Google Plus community I created for the students in the class, to give them an opportunity to continue to connect with each other over time if they chose to. And sitting and scrolling through the thousands of photographs is a much more effective way of thinking about them to me than looking at pins. Although looking at pins is fun, I always get oohs and ahs when I spin the globe in real time. But this is a reminder to me that these are real people who, to one of Peter's points, who are bringing in knowledge that I need to honor as I'm trying to communicate to them what I'm doing. So what am I doing, right? So this little MOOC of mine, these are the 6, was called Understanding Media by Understanding Google. It's based on an undergraduate course I teach at Northwestern that is a media literacy course that's offered across the university. I set it up so that 2/3 of the students are from the journalism school and 1/3 are not, so that the journalism students can interact with these ideas in the presence of people that ultimately are in the audiences that they're trying to reach when they get out and do their work. And we made a conscious decision on the front end, the administration and I, here's the a little bit more of it, to, in this little MOOC of mine, try to make the students shine by asking them to kind of do a fairly rigorous version of of a course. This is not a course that they could pass by watching me yammer on video and then, get the quiz in one window and the video in the other and wait for me to give them the answer. I actually asked them to buy 6 books. There was a lot of blowback on that as they accused me early on of trying to make my friends rich. There's 50,000 of us. If they all buy a book, it's going to go to the top of Amazon's chart. No. Fortunately, there was somebody in the forums or in the Google Plus community who was happy to explain to them the economics of book publishing, and I didn't have to do that. But they also had to, this is about half the workload, same number of books, but other than that, half the workload of my undergraduate version of this course, which is 20 sessions long, of an hour and a half each. So video lectures, you know about that. I did on-camera interviews with some of the authors of the books that they were asked to read. We did so that we could try to have some in-person connection. I solicited questions from students, the best questions. I invited the questioners into a live Google Plus Hangout where they could interact with someone from Google, and then we also did another Hangout inviting Chicago area students to campus. And we got them engaged, and we heard a little bit about this in the discussion yesterday in these discussion forums where over 6 weeks there were 27,500 posts on topics either that I created or that others. So when you add all these numbers up, I came up with a new definition for MOOC. I call it the means to overwhelm Owen completely. And maybe the way we could distinguish that, I was joking at dinner last night, is that maybe I could call it a MOOC instead of a MOOC. And then we also wouldn't have the cognitive dissonance of the earlier definition of the word MOOC. But that's the background on what it was that the students were asked to do and did. And now I'll talk about some of what I measured and and what I might have learned. But one of the things I had to decide early on, and this is not a surprise to you, because we've heard a lot, even in these 2 days plus, about the low retention rates of courses. Who should we really study? I mean, when I figure out who's worth looking at, should I start with the number of people who registered and use that as the denominator to my fraction, or the number who actually took a look at the course after they registered? Because registering is kind of like putting something in your shopping cart at Westmont or North Park or Northwestern when you're deciding what to take. Or the number of people who actually came to class, or something else. And I wrote about this shortly after the course was completed. 55,412 people enrolled. So it's a lot. It was the largest number that enrolled in any of these Northwestern MOOCs, and it felt to me kind of like the famous New Yorker cartoon of a guy and his dog. I don't know if you remember this. But the guy is saying to the dog, "Fido, roll over, sit up and beg, and I'll give you a treat." That's what the man is saying, and what Fido, and then the second panel is what Fido hears, blah, 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 treat. And so putting the word Google in the title of the book made it more attractive than my colleague who used the word calculus 4 times, right? But so anyway, 55,412 people were at least intrigued enough by the idea to click the box and sign up. As the New York Times said, it's easier to sign up for a Coursera course than it is to open an iTunes account. So there's not a lot of barriers to that. But once we announced the start date, the numbers shrank right away. 25,090 of those people I never saw. Like they never came to the course. So it's like, should I count them when I'm computing retention? So 30,000 came to the course. Maybe 3.9% is a better way to look at it. But a bunch of those were scared off by the hard syllabus. You mean I have to buy books? You mean I have to read stuff? And so actually only 19,000 people even looked at me give a lecture. And so 6% of them passed. But again, is that the right denominator? Because in order to pass, you got to do the work. And there are quizzes for evaluating, and 6,395 people who signed up, 5,063 who didn't drop. There were 1,300 people who dropped after taking a quiz and being discouraged that they didn't do well, I guess. So now the percentages start to be a little more representative, I think, of. But you also had to do homework. And we've heard a little bit about peer-graded homework, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And if anybody actually took the trouble to write an essay, more than half of those people passed. So the others maybe are auditors. I mean, so when I'm thinking about was I effective, was the learning effective, and for whom, I'm not saying this is the only way to think about it, and we should think about the 55,000 at some level, but 1,196 people were those who got 70 points out of a possible 100 and earned a wonderful statement of accomplishment featuring my digital signature. And if they paid $29, they could get one that had the Northwestern seal on it. But only 275 people did that. Anyway, I wrote about that at Quartz, which is a site run by The Atlantic, and it got cross-posted at theatlantic.com too, if you're interested in my analysis of that. At any rate, I could just leave it at that, but I thought it would be obviously better to actually ask the students about their experience. And I started long before the course began. I surveyed about 3,000 people before the course launched, another one at mid-course. And then when it was over, I emailed surveys to 2 specific subsets of the student population. 1,196 students that passed got a 20-question survey that took about 20 minutes to complete, and I was pleased that I got 821 of them back. And when I was running research at the Tribune, if I got a tenth of that, I'd have been happy. And then I sent another 700, as sort of a control, I sent another survey to people who had at least shown a little effort and wound up getting between 20 and 69 points on my grading scale. And what I'm now the numbers you're going to see the rest of the time are really largely based on this work. So I asked, and here's our, the beginning of the assessment part. Did you learn anything? And how do you feel about what you learned? What did you come into it doing? And so this is all on a 5-point scale. And what these numbers in white down here are are the percentage of people answering the question who put it in the top 2 boxes. Right? Right? We call them top 2 box numbers in marketing research world. And for the most part, among the people who passed, 4.5 on a scale of 5, I'm happy with what I learned. The 2 that matter the most to me, frankly, are I learned things I didn't expect. Now it's not because learning loves ignorance, right? I mean, we kicked that around for a little bit, but learning does love curiosity, and learning, I think, does love engendering more learning. And then because I'm an internet guy, right, I care a lot about this viral piece. I learned things I shared with others. In the news business these days, we think a lot about the experience that people have when they encounter media. And one of those experiences is I want to tell my friends. I want to share with my friends what I learned. You know, I get some social capital by telling them something that they didn't know before and that I didn't know. And so I was happy that 88% had a top 2 box number on, yeah, I did learn things that I shared with other people. So where did you learn this? And this kind of also gets to some of our other points about learning from peers as well as from professors. Actually, I was a little surprised that the video lectures wound up being the highest rated, but then again, they are by far the most, when you think about a MOOC, when you think about this sort of course, you think about video lectures, and so maybe people were predisposed to say that they learned from me there. But they also said that they learned by completing the essay homework assignments that I gave them, 4.37 on a 5-point scale, and in assessing each other's work. And this is a piece of the peer interaction that I'm interested in too. Now, this is not traditional undergraduate education, and maybe we shouldn't be surprised that people learned. To the point that, another point that we heard this morning, you want people who know how to learn when you are dealing with them on an independent basis. And these are students that largely know how to learn. If you base it on their educational experience, 4% said high school or less. I heard from one kid who lives in Libertyville, who is a suburb near Chicago. There were some high school kids and there were some community college graduates, but look at the big purple slice of that pie, 43% with master's degrees. And then beyond that, JDs, MDs, and PhDs. So, highly educated audience, and that actually is not out of character with overall Coursera audience numbers. Because they're highly educated, they're older, that's probably not a bulletin either. The sort of traditional undergraduate population number, people who are 19 to 23, was only 8% of the class. So if we ever thought this was going to, at least at this stage, we were replacing undergraduate education, these numbers would give the lie to that right away. And you already saw the map. They're all over the map. With North America actually losing out to Europe in terms of the distribution. Specifically, just 29% of the graduates, now this is not from my survey, this is from the IP addresses we sniffed out, were in the US of A, followed by India, Spain, Canada, the United Kingdom. I assigned some of my writing and some of my speeches as part of the homework in this course. One of the cheerful outcomes of that was that for a couple weeks in September and October, OwenYoungman.com was in the top 200 websites in India. So, you know, if any of you are looking to goose traffic to your personal websites, this might be a way to do it. In all, 87 countries were identified as having people who passed the course. In the registered student population, the 55,000, we identified 163 countries out of the 196 ballpark that are in the United Nations. So, and people are, and this is before Coursera blocked access to, like Sudan and Libya and such. But, so that's where they were. A lot of English speaking there, but not all. And the language challenge is another interesting one that I've thought about. So the course is in English. And 41% of the students in the course who took the survey said that that was their native language, but that's still a minority. And I had anticipated this. I did a fair amount of work on the front end trying to remove colloquialism from my lectures and strip out ambiguity, but you can't always do it. At one point I talked about how Google, just the scale of Google's revenue, right? $50 billion last year in ad revenue. And how, in that context, $1 million is a rounding error. And I had several students post in the forums that what did I mean rounding error? A phrase I used all the time in the business world, but too colloquial for them. Nevertheless, probably again because it was such a highly educated audience, I asked them in the survey, was it hard for those of you who said English was not your first language to succeed? And 36% wins just right, and just very small slice, like 9%, said it was fairly or very difficult. This is based on 449 people who were non-native English speakers. There were a lot of people who did really well and some who struggled, but that was also part of the peer learning because the students had to grade each other, right? That's how this peer grading thing works, and many of them are trying to express their ideas in a language they don't originally speak. And so the students were encountering all kinds of things I didn't anticipate. One of them posted, I found somebody who posted in Russian. Well, I had to go into the forums and explain that, well, no, this course is in English. Please redo your assignment in English. Run it through Google Translate, for crying out loud. But this was like one of my favorite comments about this issue. Is a woman in New Jersey. And she said, in response to a thread where people were talking about the difficulties they were having, and she said, you know what? I'm learning to read for intended meaning. This has always been hard for me, and I think it's a useful skill to have. I didn't teach her to change her orientation, but the experience of doing that had a profound effect on her. Yeah, it's been a challenge sometimes reading other people's papers when their English skills aren't great, but then I think of what it must be to try and write complex ideas in another language. And someone else, I want to take a moment to express my awe and admiration. And so there was very little whining as the students, I think, began to learn a different way of looking at how to approach communicating with people outside their own cultures. At least that's an inference I choose to draw. Your mileage may vary. And this amazed me. This is from my mid-course survey, where I asked people how they felt about reading comments in the forums and exchanging ideas there. And did they enjoy it, or was it a pain? Were they learning? I am learning new ideas in the forums. This is not from me, this is from the other students. 3.85 on a 5-point scale, 72% in the top two boxes. But look at the biggest number. I want other students to succeed in the course. The experience of reading this material was evoking empathy. So at least I would argue, based on one of the things we heard this morning, can empathy emerge from a course like this? This big orange bar to me says empathy. I had a student come to me. I had 6 students on campus who helped me monitor those 27,000 posts in the discussion boards. And they had taken my undergraduate version of this course before and had gotten A's, and so I gave them the opportunity to earn the easiest $10 an hour of their life, sit at home in the middle of the night and look at online posts. And this one young man came to me halfway through and said, Professor Youngman, I have 2 confessions to make. I said, oh, great, Josh has not been doing the work. He said, first of all, he said, I thought I was a good student, but I have learned to be a better student by watching these people interact and watching them fit the work into their daily schedules and write about how they're doing it. He said, I'm more disciplined. I said, wow, that's terrific. I need to hire more of you. He said, you're not going to like the other one as well. Okay. He said, the students in the forums have formed a closer community than anything I'm in at Northwestern. I've been here 3 years. They want each other, and I hadn't done this survey yet. He says, they're trying to help each other. There's no one here who cares a peer who cares if I succeed or fail. But these people clearly are trying to help each other. Now that's actually a wake-up call for Northwestern University, perhaps, a highly competitive place where students understand that if the person in the next desk fails, it's one less person to compete with for a job. But nevertheless, I'll go back to that word, empathy. And this pattern held up all the way to the end. I wrote a piece in The Guardian early on during the course in which I questioned the efficacy of peer grading based on early comments, but before the course had really made a lot of progress. It was a couple weeks in, and I saw it as a business model problem for Coursera. If ultimately over time they want to charge for this sort of thing, and it depends at scale on students grading each other's work, if the students think they're getting jobbed by people misapplying the rubrics I've created, it's a problem. I believe the grades I received from my peers were mostly fair. 4.5 on a scale of 5. So at least for the people who chose to engage and chose to do the work, they were working at it hard enough that they didn't turn off the people they were grading. To get the maximum grade in this course, you had to every week not only do the homework, but then you had to assess 5 other people's work and then reassess your own. And a lot of people did that, as a minimum. I had people assess 100 other people's assignments some weeks because it was another peer learning thing. Like the question that caused the most, where I was oversubscribed on peer grading was I asked them in a unit of the course that was about YouTube and video, said, Siva Vaidyanathan, whose name we were kicking around yesterday, has said that YouTube is where politics and culture happen online. And I added to that, I said, I think increasingly I've demonstrated in this lecture that it's where news happens online. So tell me, in your country, in which one of those has YouTube had the most impact, and why? And so they proceeded to do that. In fact, there's one student in China who wrote this fascinating one. I didn't read all the homework, but my students would point stuff out to me, my TAs as well as students in the course. One student in China wrote how the absence of YouTube had profoundly changed Chinese culture, which is a relatively sophisticated approach. Probably, who knows, a PhD in Shangyan or something. But the peer grading appeared to be working, and I gained additional perspective. I enjoyed grading other people's work. There is, going back to the points we were making earlier, there's enough communication going on that there was learning going on in these exchanges between people in, Cairo and Kazakhstan. I had people in both those places. So some things worked. It wasn't too hard, at least in the view of those who passed. And it was paced okay, 3/4 or so. And how many hours a week did you spend? Now, I had posited in the course promotional materials it would take 2 to 4 hours. One of my friends who took the course came and saw me about a week later and said, "Oh, and you forgot you read faster than everyone else. It's not 2 to 4 hours." And, it's true, newspaper editors have been shown to be the fastest readers in the world. But nevertheless, the median fell somewhere in here, between 4 and 6 hours of work a week. That's including watching the lectures and reading the books. And this is a bit bigger number than I expected, that 14% would devote 8 hours a week to this. But that level of engagement, in a way, is cheerful for a professor, too. And some of it was in discussion form. This is just an example of a discussion forum question that helped to engender those 25,000 posts. John Wilkin of the University of Michigan is quoted by Stephen Levy, "20 years from now, interaction with a physical book will be rare. Most of that interaction will be in the study of books as artifacts." It's the librarian at the University of Michigan. Do you agree or disagree, and why? And then over the next several days, 375 people wrote, this is one of the shorter responses, responded to the idea that most of them arguing that the book as an artifact is a construct that I'm not ready to accept yet, and explaining why. And most of the reasons were not necessarily ones that I would have come up with, but getting them to engage with this, even in the concept of the fact that they were reading ebooks, most of them, was encouraging to me that I was getting them to think about it. Some people said, yeah, you can be your own publisher, but other people said, no. It's kind of like, I don't know, has any of you read the Gary Stengart book, Super Sad True Love Story? So one of the things in there is that it's become culturally unacceptable. The smell of books has become culturally unacceptable. And he has to and I wouldn't, it's a hard book to recommend on a Christian college campus because there are parts of it that I wouldn't recommend to Westmont or North Park students, either one. But this short-term dystopia where books are rejected because of their odor, that's sort of what's envisioned by this. And these students would argue that we're not quite there. Some things maybe didn't work as well. This is survey results from the 126 people who didn't pass the course but sent in my survey. And it's nothing that I guess I wouldn't be surprised. Should have taken less time. The deadline should have been more flexible. The credential should have been more valuable. And I want to talk about the credential in a minute. And or I got behind in the readings and I couldn't catch up. But even I was cheerful about this. This is the people who didn't pass the course, the ones who got between 20 and 69 points. This is sort of like the equivalent of my course evaluation at Northwestern, I guess. 66% at least said it was more interesting than they expected it to be. Well, if you didn't think it was going to be interesting, why did you take it? But, and a good use of time, even if they didn't get that wonderful certificate with my signature on it. But of those who passed, half of them said it exceeded their expectations, and another 42% exceeded some and met the rest. So that's one way to say, was there value? Did the students perceive value? Are they glad they spent 8 hours a week on this? Maybe. What do MOOCs mean in that context? This is what this slide is largely what I wrote about in the Chronicle of Higher Education, where I held, I plan on listing my participation in a resume, even though I didn't pay anything for it, right? I plan on mentioning my participation to current or future employers. What I argued in the Chronicle is that whether these courses have, and I think this is helpful in the context of the discussion we've been having, and I'd be interested in your response, whether whatever level of certification people get out of taking these courses, the value ultimately is not going to be assigned by us, the Academy. It's not up to us to say whether it's valuable or not. It's going to be up to, we can huff and puff and try to blow the MOOC house down, and maybe we should based on a lot of things we heard this week. But the students are going to decide if they want to claim this as part of their educational resume. Could we be headed to a world where a hiring manager, where it becomes kind of like a college admissions person? Well, yeah, this person's got straight A's and a perfect SAT, but where's her volunteer work in Africa? Well, if you haven't taken 6 MOOCs in the topic that you're applying for a job in, will you be disadvantaged compared to somebody else? I don't know. But it'll be hiring managers, bosses, and individual students who I think determine the value. We can choose whether or not to offer courses like this. We can choose whether it's a reasonable extension of the goal of the university, the mission of the university, or whether it's a reasonable way for a professor to test her or his theories or to get wider currency for her or his ideas. But ultimately, I don't think it's up to me. And I guess that's where I'd be happy to stop, take questions, and have a discussion. I don't want to position myself as an apologist for or against MOOCs. I did this as an experiment, and I'm going to teach it again in a few months and try to improve things that didn't work, and then start to put results side by side and have some level of a controlled experiment. But I think the university and I are interested in seeing if this has legs and whether there are some of those ancillary goals that can be achieved. So I would be happy to entertain questions if you have any.